My name is Teresa Gagne, and on behalf of the Botany Committee of Nature Vancouver, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's presentation. I want to start off by stating that we are grateful and honored to be living on and sharing the natural beauty of the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of many First Nations people. In my case, those of the Coast Salish, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. Those living outside the Lower Mainland are encouraged to learn and honor the peoples whose lands they share. We appreciate that their past centuries of stewardship have preserved these beautiful areas for our enjoyment today, and acknowledge the need to work with them to safeguard these lands and all their inhabitants for future generations to appreciate.
I guess we'll get started here. Thank you again for having us. And I'm going to share my screen and we'll go through a presentation here, just overviewing many of the things that Teresa has already mentioned. And then I'll hand it over to Karla, who's the person you probably want to hear from more than me on the vegetation side and the more specific botany related things. But yeah, we'll see what you think. So I'm just going to share my screen here and away we go. And Teresa, maybe you can confirm that that is what you're looking at. Yeah. Okay, good. All right. So just a bit of an agenda. We're just going to talk a little bit about what FireSmart is. I'm going to highlight some of the programs that we're offering and some of the cool stuff that we're doing. Take a look at 2023 wildfire season. It was the worst fire season on record. And then take a look at what kind of is loosely being forecasted for the upcoming spring and summer. I'll take a look at the 4 layers of wildfire preparedness, is how the province is addressing wildfire threats to communities. I'll talk about embers a little bit, the home ignition zone, and then we'll hand it over to Karla to talk about vegetation and landscaping considerations as they relate to FireSmart, and hopefully have some time for some discussion. If you have questions as we're going, I think maybe we'll just wait till the end. So if you can write them down or try and remember them, we can talk about them at the end.
And people can put their questions into the chat ahead of time.
Certainly.
And we'll deal with them at the end.
So just a little bit about FireSmart. Teresa introduced it very well, but it's quite well, I shouldn't say an old organization, but it's been around more or less for 40 years. It was brought to Canada from the United States from the NFPA FireWise program. And it's really grown, I'd say, in the last 5 years exponentially. The team is much larger, and the scale of what we do has grown kind of incomprehensibly. So we really pride ourselves in FireSmart BC in staying up to date on what the wildfire situation is, what the wildfire science is, and integrating that information into our programming, so we're not getting left behind as we move ahead and address the changing environment that we live in. So as mentioned, there's 12 different agencies. I was trying to go through my mind and see which one we had forgotten there, Teresa, but so it's kind of a unique organization in that FireSmart committee isn't housed under one level of government or organization. It's a group of entities that come together to steer how mitigation, prevention, preparedness, and recovery are handled in the province. So because of that, we're able to move a little more quicker than some other agencies, just because of, I guess, for lack of a better term, less red tape, I guess. So we've really moved into this emergency management planning cycle here, which is prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And FireSmart BC is involved in all of these, but not so much in the response. We're leaving that to BC Wildfire Service and the structure fire folks to deal with the active fire. We're kind of looking at the things before and after. That's our focus, and more so into the recovery phase as of late. So again, as mentioned, we focus on 7 main disciplines in the work that we do, that all kind of are interrelated and important elements to have everyone on the same page. So education piece, we're constantly developing education packages. I won't touch on everything that we're going to do, but or that we're doing, but the education piece, there's one of the cool things is really tailored education programs for all different grades from K to 12. There for I think two grade intervals through that cascade, to really get this fit into BC curriculum. It aligns with what's required for curriculum. So we're getting this into the kids getting started early, so they have an understanding as they become adults and go into the job world. Vegetation management obviously is a huge element of FireSmart, and Karla is going to be speaking to this more so. But a couple elements are our landscape hub and our plant program, which I'll leave to her. Legislation and planning, so that's helping local authorities understand what those risks are and helping build tools and resources for them. On the development phase, similarly, providing resources and things to help make sure that we're building communities with FireSmart principles in mind. Interagency cooperation is imperative, so we're speaking the same language, especially in a response type of situation. We're training together. We know what's happening when there's issues and what to do before and after. And then emergency planning, of course, is critical, especially for the public. Knowing how wildfires are affecting communities, what to do before, during, and after reduces a ton of stress. Just makes wildfire events, which are becoming more common, easier to manage for everybody. Oh, and there's Ember, the new FireSmart mascot, somewhat replacing Smokey the Bear. We're not totally kicking him out the door, but just fresh face, fresh fox for everyone. So FireSmart BC is really invested into conducting research. So this is where we're getting a lot of updates to how we're going to make changes, right? Whenever there's a catastrophe, FireSmart BC, at least wildfire catastrophes, FireSmart BC is involved in understanding why. We're asking the why, what, and how kind of questions. So some of the interesting ones we're working on right now are the Grouse Fire Complex and the Adams Lake Fire Complex from this 2023 wildfire season, which was pretty bad, obviously. And there'll be some publications similar to the Lytton review if you've taken a look at that. Really interesting case study on what happened and how we could improve the situation in the future. The 2024 Northwest Territories Crown Fire project is one that we shelved last year because of the wildfire season getting going a little early, but we're really interesting. We're going to be running crown fires at structures that we built in the Northwest Territories, and understanding with greater detail how radiant heat works and firebrands, embers, contacting these structures and igniting them, and what sort of structural cladding can support better resilience to structures in the future. So really excited about that. Hopefully we can kick it off this spring, but again, looks like we might be headed into an active wildfire season earlier than usual. And this 34-to-1 ratio is really interesting. This is created by the Institute of Catastrophic Loss Reduction, and they came up with this value. So $1 in doing FireSmart activities in a community on a long enough timeline will produce a 34-to-1 cost benefit ratio. So just goes to show how little you can do will make such a huge impact. So this past summer, as all of you I'm sure are familiar, was the worst wildfire season on record for a number of reasons. I've highlighted some statistics here in red that are the high mark for the past 7 years, but this year really touched on a lot, certainly in the suppression costs and hectares burned and total wildfires, I guess, to that extent too. So very active wildfire season. And there's a couple photos from this past wildfire season there. So just a couple things to touch on. It's hard to fathom the amount of hectares burned. A hectare is about the size of a football field for comparison. So 2.84 million football fields were burnt this year. Tens of thousands of people forced to evacuate, hundreds of homes destroyed, very costly for the insurance industry. The impacts were widespread. When you have wildfire seasons like this, it's not just the immediate physical issues, it's the greater impact on society that often get overlooked. So that's, includes human well-being and health and those sorts of things. It was also the hottest year in over 100,000 years in the world. And I believe that is an even longer date range for Canada. Canada's experiencing climate change a lot quicker than a lot of other regions in the world. So looking ahead, 2024, I just pulled some stuff from the end of the fall here, and then some snow water equivalency information from the River Forecast Center. So this fire weather map, this is of the drought code. So that's the deep organic layer of fuels in the province. And that kind of gives an indication of what our wildfire season is going to look like in the spring. The drought code takes a long time to change. It needs a significant amount of precipitation to permeate into those deeper layers to change those codes. So this was October 1st. Unfortunately, not out of the norm to be this dry going into winter, but in combination the low water content of the snow and snowpack this year, we're looking at heading into a drought and probably a pretty early wildfire season again. So those have big implications for the province, but it's also, I hope motivational. Great time to be talking about this stuff. Maybe we can get ahead of a lot of things, not to be too foreboding. So how are we preparing for wildfire? There's kind of four main tiers that I like to look at. So there's the landscape scale. We're gonna go from broad to right to your home. So landscape scale, that includes the fuel treatments, the fuel modification projects, the harvesting that's happening around communities with kind of a different lens on it. It's usually not conventional types of harvesting. Your clear cuts and things like that. There's a little more care taken typically. I can't speak for all types of harvesting in all locations by all types of licensees, but that's generally the idea, is to provide a little more protection for communities from wildfire through removing fuels from adjacent to them. That includes at times prescribed and cultural fire, climate succession planning. So okay, we're removing trees. What trees will grow here in 20, 40, 60 years? Perhaps at the rate the climate's changing in this location, if we harvest cedar hemlock, that might not be the best plant species to regrow. Maybe it's a more xeric species like a Douglas fir or ponderosa pine, something like that. And these treatments should be viewed with more values than just timber value or wildfire protection. The photos listed or shown here are ones that I'm familiar with from, I live just outside of Nelson in the Kootenays, and the Sellis Creek fuel treatment on the right, the map there, right adjacent to the city of Nelson, was one that I was worked on, and quite a successful fuel treatment with respect to community engagement and community input, and kind of dealing with all those values. So maintaining bike trails and biodiversity, and applying fire effectively at the right time of year, and also, as the licensee, getting some timber value at the same time. And the photo on the left is actually a photo of Nelson from a different vantage point, kind of looking south across. But it's important to understand that forest structures aren't static. They're constantly changing. This photo is from 1910, I believe, and everything was burnt. Absolutely, started at zero, this forest structure. So to understand that, that we need to make people see a forest structure and like, oh, it's always been like this. It's like, no, it hasn't. Forests like disturbance. We need to either accept that disturbance will happen or try and emulate it in some way. So some of the things, in forestry that we certainly like to consider, there's obviously a lot of different legislative regulations, but kind of the goals, as I mentioned, are to emulate a natural disturbance. So fire removes a lot of the dead, suppressed, overcrowded vegetation, and that's what these thinning and fuel treatment processes try to mimic. There's a before and after photo, sort of what that would be like. At the same time, we want to maintain, that ecology and that biodiversity in these locations. So protecting wildlife trees, like the photo there, and for the birders out there, I'll reveal what those very special owl species are at the end if you ask. I won't tell you yet. Prescribed fire. Prescribed fire and cultural fire, really useful tools in obviously emulating natural fire disturbance around communities. They require a lot of care and planning and implementation safely, but once conducted, can be really useful. Obviously, emulating the thing that you're trying to is the most effective. So a really compelling photo there above of 3 types of fuel treatments, where there's no treatment, the trees were only thinned, and then there's thinning and prescribed fire applied, and you have a maintained crown canopy. So that tells me that was done within the right prescription, or the right time of year and the right conditions, that the fire scientists knew that the fire wouldn't spread to the crown canopy, probably late spring or in the springtime sometime, to prevent that kind of thing from happening. So real effective if you can do that. And cultural fire is less for, I'm not the expert on cultural fire, but it's more designed to maintain natural processes that were applied by Indigenous in the country, for a variety of reasons, whether it's food or husbandry or whatever the case may be, building basket making materials, those kinds of things, medicines. But there can be some mutually beneficial things to applying both. So that next scale down, we're working on the landscape, but the next important thing is that community scale. So looking at creating the right documents for folks, or for communities, having guiding documents to understand what your risks are, how you're going to mitigate them, and then creating a plan for how to implement them. That includes training, includes creating dedicated staff for this stuff. FireSmart is unfortunately no longer the corner of the desk kind of job for local government. There needs to be dedicated people in these roles to ensure that the things are happening. There's FireSmart assessments and rebate programs to help motivate people on an individual, community, and neighborhood scale what those risks are, and taking steps to prevent loss from that. The emergency alert systems are something that's come about in the last little while. You can download this app on your phone, say where you are, and you'll be notified of evacuation orders, alerts, all this information. And it's all hazard stuff. It's not just wildfire. If there's a flood or wind event or whatever, terrorist attack, you'll get notified of this stuff. So it's just another way to keep informed and up to date. Every community's got a different one, perhaps, but it's worth finding out where you live if one's available. So that next tier down, so we got the landscape, got kind of the community, and then the neighborhood scale. So in actuality, this cascade of tiers, the neighborhood scale and our next one, the individual property scale, are the most important. as far as the propagation of fire into a community. And that's what I'll talk a little bit about some of the fire science that we're learning about all the time. But it's at this level that's making the most traction as far as community resilience. So working with your neighbors, understanding that your property has a role to play in the success of your overall community in a wildfire event. And we look at the home ignition zone. So these circles are to showcase what that is. And they go to about 30 meters from the structure, a home ignition zone. And we'll look at that in a minute, a little bit closer. But it's very useful to work with your neighbors for a number of reasons. One, you might be directly attached physically through fuels such as fences, vegetation, adjoining structures, those kinds of things. But also, in the event of a wildfire, and maybe this is more prevalent in rural communities, you might depend on each other for help. Who's got a chainsaw? A tree falls across the road, and you need to get out of there. Who's got a big truck? Who might need some help? Who's got, the single mother with kids? Maybe, we need to start looking out for each other at a neighborhood scale a little more. And that really plays a big role in wildfire response as well, when people are a little more cohesive. Also, you have a unified voice, forming FireSmart neighborhoods. It's not 50 people all reaching out. It's a nationally recognized unified group that has a little more leverage, I think, than the individuals. So there are some spin-offs there, just social spin-offs outside of just that FireSmart piece. The individual property scale. So this is critically important. This is the work you do at your home with the vegetation management, teaching yourself about FireSmart stuff, and understanding that you actually have a big role to play in your community's resilience to a wildfire event. It's a lot of work changing that mythos that it's a big wall of fire that just comes and there's nothing, it's a wave crashing, there's nothing you can do. That's really not the case. Fires are started by embers. 90% of structures on average are lost from firebrands blowing across fuel treatments that are done, blowing into other neighborhoods. So what you do around your house to stop it from igniting is so important. So what is the science saying? It's embers. It is embers that are blowing into communities and igniting things around homes that are causing homes to be lost from a wildfire. Typically, that spotting distance is about a kilometer and a half. This year in Lake Okanagan, we saw it spot across the lake. It's over 8 kilometers, I think, where it blew over. So, that tells me that, kind of no matter what we're doing, as far as fuel treatments and things like that, if there's going to be embers landing on the flammable vegetation next to your house, that's where we're going to make amends or achievements in preventing that spread of fire. And the firebrands there, quite a dramatic photo again of sort of the size of some of these burning particles. Firebrands are embers that have gotten lofted. So these are some building materials as well as some organic material from the forest structure. And I could talk a lot about this stuff, but in lieu of time, I'll keep going here. But the structure protection piece too, it's not a cure-all putting sprinklers on a structure and walking away. If you don't do that mitigation work of the area around your home, you're not helping the sprinklers do any work. I kept seeing this summer, these regardless of the brand, but failures in sprinkler systems because people hadn't done the FireSmart work. I like to see it as a cherry on the cupcake, right? You've done everything you can, put a sprinkler on top, it's going to do great things for you. But if you haven't done the work, it might not hold up. I have a quick video here. I won't play the whole thing in lieu of time, but we'll we'll just talk about a couple things. So this is an interesting video from Institute for Home Safety. This is a, we'll keep pausing it. This is a facility that was designed to test hurricane winds on building materials, and they retrofitted it to blow embers at a house. So this house was built in this laboratory. They built this house, put bark mulch in these wood chambers, or these wood blowing chambers, lit them on fire and blasted this house. So it's really nice to be able to have this opportunity to do these experiments in a controlled environment. For the scientists out there, having controls is really helpful in determining what does or doesn't work. But this is a pretty classic kind of house. It might be a little heavy in the bark mulch and things like that, but you know, I've seen these homes a lot across the province, and this is a reality. So they have these 5 ember generators, and this is a pretty reasonable amount of embers being produced by the head of a wildfire, certainly in that immediate space, you know, under 10 to 20 kilometer-hour winds. And there's the home with the flammable vegetation. We have vinyl gutters with material in them. There's debris on the roof. The window's open. It's a vinyl screen. And there's vinyl siding and cement fiberboard siding. So both what we're looking for and maybe some of the things we can improve on. So you can see the vinyl gutters fail quite quickly. They're really not designed to be able to withstand much of radiant heat, or especially not direct flame. They also break down from UV light and just expansion and contraction issues with our Canadian weather. Not the greatest option. The vegetation's ignited. There's material on the roof that's ignited. And an interesting component of this structure is that alcove on the corner, where we're getting a pretty strong vortice starting in there. So those are areas you really want to focus on around your own home, those inside elbows where the snow and the leaves accumulate. That's also where the embers will accumulate in a wildfire event. So perhaps there's already a pile of leaves waiting to ignite in these little corners. So you can see the increase in fire behavior when you have 2 opposing combustion or inflamed walls structures there. I'm just going to stop it there just in lieu of time, but there's a lot of great resources like this on the FireSmart BC website. So if you're curious, feel free to check that out. So I'm maybe taking a little more time than I should here. Just wanted to go through sort of how it's important to take the lens from the natural fuels, from the forest fuels, and apply them to the home and to the neighborhood and the community. So when we talk about fuels in the work that I do, we look at the continuity of them. So the vertical continuity and the horizontal continuity. And we want to put brakes in there because fire accelerates. Once it's started, it grows and grows and grows until it reaches equilibrium and is, you know, rips. We don't want fire to start running. We want to make sure it can't get legs. So we put brakes in the fuels. That's what these fuel treatments seek to do. They remove that horizontal fuel continuity. They limb up the trees to prevent the ladder fuels for the vertical continuity. They spread out the tree canopies so the aerial fuels can't connect. It's important to look at a home under the similar context. We want to break that fuel continuity, break those fuel pathways up, whether it's a fence, whether it's the pine straw you've planted. Thank goodness trees don't grow lattice for branches. We'd be in a lot of trouble if that was the case. Really, really great to carry fire. And once the aerial crown fuels of a forest fire are ignited, that crown fire can spread from tree to tree very easily. Similarly, a structure, if the roof has ignited, the ability for that roof to roof ignite a neighboring structure increases quite significantly. So the more we can do to prevent fire from getting into the crown of a forest canopy. Similarly, we want to prevent fire from getting into the roof of a house. So we have our home ignition zones to talk a little bit more about this more specifically, so we can narrow down the things that we need to do. This is another great breakdown from the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction on they've quantified what amount of work it takes to get sort of what amount of return for your investment per se. So a structure has a 90% survival rate in a wildfire event if the first 10 meters around the house has been managed for removing fuels and combustible materials, as well as having a non-combustible roof. So two things. If you're going to do two things, ensure that your roof is in good condition and non-combustible. The cedar shakes and the composite shingles, if they're degraded and they're curling and full of moss, then they've lost their fire resilience. So we want them in good shape. And then that 10 meters, you're 90% there. So if you're going to take anything away from this, clean up the stuff around your homes and make sure your roof's in good condition, and you are off to the races for sure. Inversely, 4%. If you've done nothing and your roof is combustible and there's a wildfire nearby that's going to affect that structure, very low chance of it surviving. So that immediate zone is that first 1.5 meters around the house. This is the most important place to focus on. So that's, you walk around your house with your arm out, touching the wall, it's that space. It's real tempting to store your canoe there, your winter tires, your way too many fuel jerry cans and grass clippings, but it's the worst spot for that. We want to move that stuff away from the wall, even if, you know, it doesn't have to be 10 meters, but just get it off the wall and away from the side of the house. Can make huge leaps when it comes to its resilience. Some other spin-off types of benefits, you know, it cuts down on rodents' ability to enter the house. Yeah, you know, the foundation could be affected. There are some other reasons to do this, but really, like, when we're dealing with wildfire, this is the number one thing. When structure protection units show up to a house to save it in a response phase, that's the first thing they're doing. They're throwing that stuff into the yard, getting it away from the house. So you can save them a bit of time. The photo on the right, kind of the extreme end of doing that, but beautiful, beautifully resilient immediate zone. These are some photos I took this summer doing some of the fire investigation stuff, but a few close calls for sure. The unmitigated vegetation, those were some very flammable types of plants. I believe they were cedars or junipers, and they burnt so intently that they melted the vinyl and cracked the windows. Fortunately, it wasn't sustained long enough to ignite the vinyl siding or the cladding behind, but that's a very lucky set of circumstances for that homeowner. The plastic shed has deformed from radiant heat. Again, didn't ignite because whatever was creating that radiant heat didn't continue, and there wasn't direct flame contact, but that could have ignited and then into the soffits, and away we go. And the material, the belongings against the house, this stuff, if you're going to do one thing, get it away from the wall. You don't have to throw it away, just put it somewhere else. Put it in a shed away from the home, that kind of thing. Roofs and vents, again, won't drill this stuff in too much, but really important to just make sure that the roof are clean of debris. There's not flammable debris in the gutters. Your dryer vent, clean the dryer vent, make sure it's working. Don't put anything over it, but just ensure that it's working effectively. The intermediate zone. So this is that first 10 meters that the Institute of Catastrophic Loss Reduction was looking at. First 10 meters is really important. Second to the immediate zone. Right. Again, we want to remove flashy fuels here, break up those fuel pathways, break up that continuity. We don't want fences connecting structures. Just put a metal gate in it, and that's often enough to just break that fuel pathway. Landscape timbers, bark mulch pathways. If you can just put a few, patio blocks in there instead. Oftentimes people are evacuated and nobody's there to watch this slow moving fire just fuel find. The tenacity of fire is incredible. It will find little avenues if they're there. And then lastly, the extended zone. So this is up to 30 meters from a house or a structure. This is our third home ignition zone. This is kind of where our fire science, it doesn't end, but where a lot of the experimentation and case studies look at. Beyond 30 meters, it really doesn't matter a whole lot as far as that structure surviving, if you've done everything within there. I shouldn't say that you shouldn't be concerned about beyond 30 meters, but focus with, right at the house and work here out to 30 meters. And if you have the opportunity to go beyond, then you got to start considering some of these other things that are bigger forestry questions, and you might need to get some additional support understanding that. But same things apply. We're not trying to exclude fire beyond 30 meters. It's just we want to break up that fuel pathway so that those fires can't take runs. And lastly, just a couple things, emergency planning, I mentioned before, but the more we can do ahead of time to understand what you do before a fire, during a fire, and then after a fire is really important. If you can run through some scenarios in your head with your family, where are we going? What are we grabbing? What do we need to shut off? What do we need to do? You can make a lot of headway there if there ever is emergency. There's some really great training online on the FireSmart BC website. If you're interested in this stuff, a really quick one, takes about an hour. FireSmart 101 training, just a brief overview. Imagine if you got us here talking to you on a Thursday night, you probably want to do the next one, the wildfire risk reduction training. It's actually, as far as free modular online training goes, really interesting. I think most people really get something very valuable out of it. And then there's also local FireSmart representative training. So if you want to take that next step in your neighborhoods, in your communities, to become more part of the FireSmart team, there's some courses coming up this spring that you can do for free and take kind of the next step. So some other considerations, there's a bunch of resources on the website. I won't go over everything, but think about that, what you needed for an evacuation kit. Certainly being in the lower mainland, this is an all hazards kit. It's not just a wildfire kit. Have a bit of a bin ready to go. They say 72 hours is the a minimum for sure. But there's some great lists online, and again on the FireSmart BC website. So I'm chewing into Karla's time here, so thank you very much, and I'm going to pass the torch over to her.
Thanks, Joel. That was awesome. Teresa or Dennis, just wondering about how much time left so I can use it the best. What works for you guys?
Sorry, I was muted there. We don't have a strict cutoff time, so I would say just, do what you'd prepared to do. Don't worry that you have to cut anything. I think it's interesting and important topic, and there's no real particular cutoff, so just do what you'd prepared.
Sounds good. Does the screen show up there for you?
Yeah, looks good.
All right. So just a little bit about myself. I think there was information maybe in your on your website, so don't want to go into me too much. But I've been in the horticulture field since '97. It's amazing how when you start talking about things in decades, right? And in a variety of capacities. I've done landscape design, installation, maintenance, run a education program for a municipality when it came to plant health and pest management. Had the opportunity to teach a couple courses, soil science and landscape design for the first year students of the Thompson Rivers University. And I love the outdoors. I've been involved in outdoor stuff all my life. So I was interested to learn about your group here. And I'm just wanting to move my one screen. Just wondering what you see now. Do you still see the main screen, or has it disappeared on you?
No.
Okay, good. Just because my notes are in one little spot that I can't see now. There, I can see them. Okay, we're good. So briefly, going to look at some interesting things here when we're talking about FireSmart and FireSmart landscaping. So what is that? We looked at FireSmart as a whole with what Joel was describing for us, but if we bring it down, like he brought it from landscape on the big scale, now we're down to the home level. And what does that mean? And where and why are FireSmart activities, so important? Is it compatible with other environmental objectives? You folks with Nature Vancouver are involved with a lot of the natural world. And so how does FireSmart fit in with that? So we'll look at that briefly. And then as well as the how. How do we achieve a FireSmart landscape? So I'll point you in the direction of some amazing resources, as well as taking a quick look at it, and yeah, take a note of your questions so we can address them afterwards. So if we look at FireSmart landscaping, really it's just an attractive, because if we want to enjoy it, an attractive and functional space that's not only designed, but it's installed and maintained with the goal of limiting ignition or the spread of fire from the landscape beyond to structures. So in that picture, there was a project I worked on back in 2011 or 2012. I had the opportunity to look at a municipal building that was a booster station, and it became a instructional property for xeriscaping and fire smarting. So it was kind of interesting to see this photo that I took about 10 years ago on the FireSmart Canada website. So I've been involved with FireSmart since about 2011, 2012, in working on their landscape guide, and now more recently with FireSmart BC with the landscape guide and other educational materials. So kind of near and dear to my heart. I was evacuated in 2021, my family and I, from our rural property. So I know firsthand in evacuating animals and things like that, how stressful that can be. So when I have the opportunity to speak for something like this, and share what I've learned and what I know. And just to clarify, I'm not a fire specialist. I'm more of a plant person. But bringing those two together, starting in 2012 and moving forward, it's something that I directly connect with. Now, Joel's shown the home ignition zone. So the where. So there's the wildland urban interface, or WUI, that you might come across, WUI. And then there's the home ignition zone. So, and Joel also showed us the embers and how far they can travel. So it's not just backing onto green spaces that can affect us, those embers can fly or travel, depending on the intensity of the fire, the height of the fire, the winds, and the materials. So not only on lands bordering green spaces, but in the case of the Okanagan, it jumped the lake. So not just a wall of fire coming. And that's why those different zones that Joel described, the immediate, intermediate, and extended zone, are so crucial in saving a structure. So here we're looking at like homes, and all of us have homes, so we can connect that way. But from what I understand, a little bit looking at your folks' website, is you're involved in other projects where removing, say, invasive species and replanting. So having that in mind with, you know, the work that you're doing on that level and how that could impact neighboring properties and structures. So something that we can take and apply to our direct life as well as our other portions of our life. And so the where and the why, this picture on the left, that's in Kamloops. And so I included this photo because that property was adjacent to a green space where like it was sort of a natural park type space that I think it might have been a cigarette, I'm not sure, but ignited the grasses that were in that space. It traveled up to that cedar hedge, and then the cedar hedge right adjacent to the building ignited it. And this video that I'm not sure if I can get it to work here. Let's see. Yeah, that one's not going to connect. If you don't mind, I can stop sharing for a moment. I have the link in another spot. And I will bring that up. And if we start here, this was a cigarette, but it just gives the pretend that cigarette is an ember, one of those ones that was flying around in the Okanagan fire or Adams Lake or wherever. Just pretend the cigarette that was put in this, supposedly put out or extinguished, and in the cedar hedge. Let's just see how quickly that fire can spread. Stop sharing that one and I'll go back to the presentation. Thank you for your patience here. There we go. Is that back up where we were before? Looks like it. Okay, great. Yeah, so that just tells us why we need to pay attention to the type of materials that we have around our home and how quickly things can change for the worse. Unfortunately, in that case, they were able to get that one out. Now, if we look just briefly at what I call the bigger picture or sustainable messages, because I've been involved in a number of these, and it's easy to get like into a silo and thinking about one aspect. But if you don't want to create a problem or solve a problem and be creating another problem at the same time. So if you thought only of pollinators, well, that's great for the pollinators, and pollinators are super important. Obviously, we need them, and they need habitat, and there's things that we can do for them. But if we're using plants that are extremely flammable in our landscape, then if there's a fire in the vicinity, then we've created a problem there. So we need to provide food for pollinators. We need to provide habitat, but choose fire-resistant plants. Or say, for instance, one of the recommendation is leaving debris and leaving materials or piles of leaves or something for pollinators to overwinter or some habitat. Okay, we're not saying don't do that entirely, but don't do that within the 10-meter zone, or do that farther away from a structure so that they have habitat but not contributing to risk. Birds and wildlife, well, some birds can be pests. Some birds we want to attract into our neighborhood, into our yard. So attracting, if you border onto green space, deer, that can be a bit of a problem, but some people like deer. So just picking and choosing plants that are achieving not only the desired results when it comes to birds and wildlife, but plants that are going to burn slower or ignite slower. Native plants, obviously, part of what you folks are involved in. And so again, we want to choose plants that are great for the environment, but also ensure that we're putting them in the proper location for risk or reducing risk. Something I've been involved with heavily is water conservation or xeriscaping, because I'm in the Kamloops region. I live about 30 minutes east of Kamloops, and Kamloops is a semi-arid climate. Now I'm talking to folks at the coast, but in recent years, there's been water restrictions, that's my understanding, and then all of a sudden you have landscapes that previously received more water than they may have in certain drought years, and now they've become a bit of a problem. So conserving water is definitely something that we want to work on in our landscape, if at all possible. Xeriscaping is just a term to achieve water conservation in a creative manner. And then there's FireSmart, obviously why we're here, and we'll get into that shortly, but just it is possible for all of those different, seemingly different goals or objectives that can be compatible. So some of the things that we would do in our landscape would be to, as far as, and Joel showed some awesome pictures of that. I'm going to have to borrow some of your pictures, Joel. Is reducing those fuel ladders. So if you think of a ladder, what do you do with a ladder? You climb it. Well, or ladder fuels, if you're using something like grasses or with landscape design, generally you start with, say you had your lawn, and then you have front-facing border plants, and then you might have shrubs in behind, and then you would have trees above that. And that would be typical of, say, sort of a landscape design and aesthetically achieving a look that somebody's after. But we need to work with those design considerations and fire risk. Where we might do that is going to be affected by trying to reduce fire igniting next to a home. So we want to minimize those ladder fuels, or if at all possible. And there's different ways of doing that. We'll look at that in a moment. But if you have a larger property and have a canopy of evergreens, then you would maintain at least 3 meters, roughly about 10 feet between the mature canopies, so that there's not that continuity. Joel mentioned like having fuel breaks, and we could use rock pathways, we could use paving stones, we could use retaining walls, dry creek beds, or even having ponds or streams. Those are some things that we can build into a landscape that break up the fire moving across it in a continuous path. Something else to think about too, and because we're going to look at maintenance in a bit, is that looking at how much time you have to devote to maintaining your garden, maintaining your yard, because it's not a one and done thing. So keep that in mind if you're redoing an area, is how much time you actually have to maintain something. I'm a horticulturist and maintain a lot of landscapes. Sometimes we just don't have the time we think that we're going to have to look after something. Now, lawns. A healthy lawn is an amazing, effective fuel break. Still, we don't really want to have lawns right up against our house because they will dry out and still can ignite, but much slower than a lot of other landscape materials. So lawns are a really effective fuel break. Lawns are not popular in Kamloops from the municipalities' point of view because of the amount of water that takes to maintain them. But there are things that you can do to help lower water consumption and still keep things green. And I just have a few pictures here of showing like clover, or there's micro clovers or other things that you can plant with your lawn in order to keep it. If you think about it, and you see in the middle of summer a lawn that's dried out, but patches that are green, what are those green patches? They're patches of clover. And in the past, folks used to think of those as a weed, but it used to be, well, actually people nowadays think of it as a weed, but it's slowly making a shift back to what it was originally. High quality grass seed mix used to have clover in it because it's a legume that fixes nitrogen and keeps moisture in the soil. So it fixes nitrogen. It pulls nitrogen out of the atmosphere. And if you think of your fertilizer, your NP and your K, the nitrogen, that's the things that keep things green. Well, you don't need to do that if you have clover in your lawn. And it's great for maintaining a lot more moisture and not igniting as fast. So just a little plug for, and it outcompetes other things that are perceived as weeds. Not everybody thinks of these things as weeds, but, and I'm thinking probably most of the people in the audience here aren't as prone to use pesticides. And clover is a great way of reducing that, even if that is something that you might consider using. It helps a lot. So it keeps things green. So plants, when we're looking at plants, the botany side of things, what is it that makes plants more likely to burn or less likely to burn? And even when I'm going to show you a chart here in a moment, even the plants that are fire resistant are not equally fire resistant. They don't all ignite or not ignite at the same time, but all plants will burn. But what makes them resistant? Well, moist, supple leaves like succulents, those are less likely to burn. Plants that aren't likely to accumulate a lot of dead material in them or have dry bits and pieces on them that will ignite. Something that has a fair amount of sap but doesn't have a lot of odor. So big difference there between saps. There's, on the flip side here, we've got the gummy resinous, odorous type sap versus the water-like sap. So just a comparison between different plant materials or composition. And like I mentioned, they're not equally going to ignite at the same time, but when they have these fire-resistant characteristics, they will ignite and burn slower. Another thing is if it has an open branching habit, then there's less fuel for the fire. So you might think of some different ones that fall into those categories just off the top. And normally if I was in an in-person environment, we could pick out some plants, but we can look at a chart in a moment. For instance, on this slide here, we're looking at what is planted. And we'll look at where it's planted in a minute, but what is planted? And so we've got this is a product that we have created for garden centers so that they can use it out in their section where they've got these annuals and perennials. But if I stop sharing that one and I share, where did my screen go? Oh, it disappeared on me. Well, I'll bring this one up because I can get to it fairly quickly. This is the landscaping hub that Joel had mentioned. And I'm just taking us to a fire-resistant plant chart. So all those characteristics that I was showing you earlier, or just previously, we've done the homework and created a chart. And so for those that you, like myself, prefer the scientific, you can pick your trees or your shrubs or your vines, all these different categories of plants, and you can sort it by the common name or by the scientific name. And if we just scroll down to the bottom, because you see these home ignition zones, remember that graphic that we were looking at? We just scroll down. There's a legend here that tells you the distances that you can, what plant is suggested for which area. As well, we've got the irrigation requirements, sun and shade preferences, whether or not it's the type of leaf that it has. And down at the bottom, a list of plants that should avoid. And you'll see they're mostly conifers. And if you're not sure, I think you guys would probably all know what type of hardiness growing zone you're in, but you can type in your address or place and find your cold hardiness zone, because those are also in this plant chart. I don't mean to make anybody dizzy, but so there's the Canadian hardiness zone approximated as well as the US hardiness zone. In the map, that's going to be the Canadian one. So just wanted to draw your attention to how this chart's put together, so take some of the guesswork out of it for you.
Just
If you're
one question, Karla. So the colors, the red was the more fire resistant, and this green is sort of intermediate.
Yeah, in this instance, the colors are meant to match the graphic, which had the immediate zone, the extended zone, the immediate, the intermediate, and the extended. So that's where that's showing here. So you got your immediate zone would be red. You won't find any plants anywhere in the chart that are meant for that zone because they all will ignite. So that's meant to be the non-combustible zone. And then intermediate zone is orange. So 1.5 to 10 meters, extended 10 to 30. And then there's the extended beyond. Purple, I don't have the research for it yet. These plants are generally considered fire resistant, definitely better than the conifers. I don't have the information or the scientific, there's anecdotal, so generally accepted, and then there's the research. So that's where the purple category is. Again, much better than the avoids that we've got down at the bottom here. So that just is making that connection there so that folks can go on to this later and get an idea of what they can use in the landscape and in which zone. So I'll just go back to the presentation. Nope, not that one. Where'd it go? Here we go. Sorry to go off and on. I just didn't get the links properly put there. So that's the what is planted and the plant materials that we can use. And I showed you there where it showed the different leaf types. So that we've got, and I think I'm okay using these terms here, deciduous, meaning the leaves are shed in the fall. Conifers, they bear seeds and cones and they have needles and scales like the mid picture there. The top one would be the fall color of nine bark. That's probably Dart's gold nine bark. And then this bottom one, a broadleaf evergreen. So it keeps its leaves all year. They do shed, but just not in the same way that deciduous do. And that's the emerald gaiety euonymus or winter creeper there. So just knowing that there aren't any conifers on the plant list. Well, they're on the avoid list, just not on the fire resistant list. And so that helps with making decisions again in that immediate, intermediate, and extended zone. So we have the what is planted. This graphic is great for where it is planted. So it's not saying that you can't have some of your beloved plants, it's just where they are is important. Because plants and how they burn differ in their intensity. The height of plants, the reason why lawn is so great is it's low, it's a low ground cover. In addition to it's generally well watered and green, but it's really low. So even if you take junipers, if it's further away in your landscape or because there's ground covered junipers, not going to be the same risk as like an upright juniper hedge. So plant height, that's one extreme example, but plant height makes a difference in fire behavior. We talked about the saps and whatnot. That'll have contribute to the difference in intensity of fire burning. Wind contributes to flame angle. And then embers, Joel showed us some amazing shots of embers. So all of those things are part and parcel of like where you're going to plant some of those different plants and why they are more suitable for either the intermediate, extended, or beyond. There's some things that come up all the time for questions, and that has to do with hedges and screening and privacy, what can be planted and where it can be planted, and mulches. So we're just going to take a couple minutes to look again at where things are planted. So you'll probably recognize the arborvitae or the hedge cedar or pyramid cedar. This one's actually emerald cedar or smaragd. So that is not something you want within 10 meters of your home. Because of the video that we watched a little while ago and how combustible they are. They're like gasoline. So what can you use in place of that? Because folks still want privacy, some screening. Is there an exact alternate? Not really, but you can get some pretty attractive substitutes. And this one here is the, excuse me, I'm losing my voice just a second. Broadleafed evergreen, or Fraser photinia, or Photinia fraserii. So yeah, there's some alternates that can used. And even with that one is more suited for the extended zone. And like Joel showed earlier, some of those zones overlap, not just in your outline property of a property, but it can extend into your neighbor's property as well, or other adjacent structures. So we want to keep that in mind. A couple other examples. Sometimes you want something like this poplar, which is the Swedish columnar aspen. So very narrow, deciduous, quite tall. So it's not something you'd want right next to your house, obviously, and it's a better choice than cedars. But just showing some possible varieties out there. Obviously, that's going to lose its leaves in the winter, but a lot of times we're not out in the winter and don't need the same type of screening that we would prefer in the summer. And this other, this is Glossia belia. And there's a number of other different options. That website that I took you to, there's a section on hedges, and there's a chart there with all of these different pictures and suggestions in it. Next one is mulches. So I've had to really switch my thinking on this, and where and what is good to use, because again, we can use a mulch that's great for our plants, but can be highly flammable. So up against a home, anything organic is not a good choice, because if you think, if you go outside and look around your property, and despite how meticulously you maintain it, where are things going to accumulate, and what's going to accumulate with wind? Organic materials are going to accumulate in those nooks and crannies. That's where embers are also going to accumulate. If you think like a leaf, a dry leaf, or think like some bit of bark mulch that's blown around, or if you think like an ember, those all end up in the same place. So we want to be careful what we're putting up against buildings, even though organic materials, because they break down and they have all the nutrients and supply the essential items that are required for plants to grow. In that non-combustible zone, that 1.5 meters, if you take plants out of there anyways, because they shouldn't be there, not the best choice. Putting rock there is a much better choice, but even out away from your yard, from your house, you saw what happened with all those embers and how quickly they ignite and blow around. Just choices that, if we have the opportunity to make, we can still naturally fertilize our plants, just maybe not using organic mulch. There is a chart that is also on the website that shows up here. I don't expect you to read all of the fine print, just to be aware of it, where it compares inorganic materials with other types of organic materials, and where you could look at the levels of risk and what you might want to, some changes that you might want to make around structures and within close proximity to a structure. So those are mulches. Mentioned earlier about maintenance, and it's not a one and done. You could have the most fire resistant plant, but if it's allowed to dry out, then it now becomes a fire risk. If it's allowed to accumulate dry materials in it, it becomes a greater fire risk. So we have to not only choose the right plant and put it in the right place, we need to look after it so that it stays as low a risk as possible. Now, we mentioned earlier about having some beloved plants. I know I've had folks send me pictures and ask, what should I do with these? And I'm like, well, if at all possible, root prune it, dig it, let it, some fine roots generate around the plant, dig it up and move it to a less risky portion of your property. If it's trees, and sometimes there are tree protection bylaws that you can't actually go down and cut a tree down. Some of those might change over time with how fire is starting to behave, or not start, fire behaves the way it is all the time, but just with climate change and increased risk. So some of those bylaws might change, but in the meantime, pruning those trees so that up like a good 2 meters from the ground to reduce those fuels that Joel showed us earlier, where there's branches and debris at a lower level. So pruning that up will make a big difference too in what we can, how we can mitigate risk in adjacent to our properties. So if we look at the next slide, it kind of summarizes a little bit that you can have a successful FireSmart landscape. And in doing so, you're going to reduce the risk of ignition around your home. And it still be an enjoyable space, a space that you like to spend your time in. I know I mentioned living out on a rural property. It's treed. We actually did some logging. We did not like the smoke and the ash and the everything that was happening the night that we had to evacuate. We had done a bunch of mitigation around our property, but it makes you second guess what you've done. And when the fire is coming, it's a much better feeling knowing that we've done all that we can and not have regrets if the worst happens, if we drive away. And there's a really great video on the FireSmart website or on Facebook even, and Instagram, showing a property in West Kelowna where she was leaving her property thinking she was never going to see it again. She had mitigated a lot of risk and her property survived. So I know I'll feel better when we get more done on ours, but we can just do what we can. And because we're FireSmart and we're connected with FireSmart Canada, we want to acknowledge their use of the different trademarks. And Joel's slide here, that homes that are prepared are the homes that are left standing. I know Joel and I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak at an event like this.